I want to say up front that I don't expect anyone to believe this. I've told it twice before. Once to a friend who laughed it off before he even finished his beer, and once to a woman I dated briefly who looked at me afterward like I'd told her something about myself I shouldn't have. So I stopped telling it. I'm only telling it now because it's been 3 years, and it still wakes me up sometimes, at exactly the same hour, every single time. And I've come to believe that the only way to make a thing stop owning you is to say it out loud, completely, start to finish, and let it go. Before I get into the night itself, I think it's worth telling you a little about who I was at the time, because I think it matters, the particular shape of a person's life right before something like this happens to them, the way it determines how much resistance they're able to put up against what comes next. I was 26, like I said, living alone in a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of a town that didn't have much to offer in the way of steady work, especially not for someone with my limited background. A couple years of community college I never finished. A string of warehouse and retail jobs that never quite turned into anything resembling a career. I'd grown up in that same town, knew most of the streets and most of the families well enough to nod at them in the grocery store, and I think, looking back, that this familiarity is part of why the hospital unsettled me as much as it eventually did, because it represented a piece of the town's own history that I'd somehow never fully registered before, a building I'd driven past 100 times as a kid without ever once wondering what had happened inside it, or what might still be happening inside it, long after it should have gone fully and permanently quiet. I took the job because I needed money, plain and simple. I'd been laid off from a warehouse position about 4 months before, and the unemployment checks were thinning out, and a guy I used to bowl with mentioned that a private security company contracted out to cover a handful of properties around the county, mostly empty commercial buildings, storage facilities, one half-built apartment complex that had stalled out when the developer ran into funding trouble. "Easy work," he said. "You sit, you walk around every couple hours, you sign a log, you go home. Nobody bothers you because there's nobody there to bother you." I called the number he gave me and talked to a woman named Carol, who didn't ask me much beyond whether I had a valid license and whether I could pass a background check, and within a week, I had a uniform that didn't quite fit and a laminated badge with my photo, looking somehow more nervous than I remembered feeling when it was taken. For the first few weeks, they had me on what they called the rotation, filling in single overnight shifts wherever someone had called out sick or quit without notice, which, I would later learn, happened more often than you'd think in that line of work, though at the time I didn't think much of it. I covered a self-storage facility twice. I covered the apartment complex once, walking concrete floors lit by a single string of construction lights, the wind moving through the open window frames in a way that made the whole building sound like it was breathing. None of it bothered me particularly. I was 26 years old and I didn't believe in anything I couldn't put my hands on, and an empty building, however creepy it looked in the dark, was still just a building. Pipes settle, wood contracts in the cold. Animals get into places they shouldn't. I had explanations for everything, and I liked having explanations for everything, because it meant I never had to sit very long with the alternative. Then, about 6 weeks into the job, Carol called me on a Thursday afternoon and told me she had a long-term placement, if I wanted it. Steady nights, 5 nights a week, better pay than the rotation work, at a property out past the edge of town that needed somebody reliable because the last few guards hadn't worked out. I asked her what kind of property. She said it was the old Mercy Hollow building. I didn't know what that was at the time. I found out soon enough. Mercy Hollow had been a hospital, a real one, full service, built sometime in the 1950s, and expanded twice over the following decades, until it sprawled out into 5 connected wings, and a separate annex building that had been added in the 80s to house an expanded psychiatric ward. It had closed a little over a decade before I ever set foot in it, the victim of the kind of slow institutional collapse that happens to a lot of rural and small-town hospitals. A merger, a larger regional medical center built closer to the highway, a long, bleeding decline in patient numbers that eventually made the whole operation financially unsustainable. The official story, the one printed in the local paper at the time, talked about a graceful transition. Patients relocated, staff reassigned or let go with severance. The building simply outliving its usefulness, the way buildings sometimes do. I didn't know, walking in for that first night, that there was an unofficial story too. The kind that only comes out later. The kind people only tell you, once you've already spent enough nights inside a place that you've earned the right to hear it. I'll get to that. The contract, as Carol explained it to me, was straightforward. The hospital had been sold to a development company that planned, eventually, to either renovate the property into mixed-use commercial space or tear it down entirely and start fresh. But in the meantime, while permits and financing and all the slow bureaucratic machinery of that kind of project ground forward, the building sat empty. And an empty building that size, full of old medical equipment and copper wiring worth stripping, and a dozen other things that attract trespassers and scrappers, needed somebody watching it. That was the job. Watch it. Walk it. Make sure nothing happened to it. Sign the log. Go home. Carol made it sound almost boring. And I remember being relieved, honestly, because boring was exactly what I wanted out of a job at that point in my life. I drove out for my first shift on a Tuesday evening in late October, which I think about a lot now, the timing of it, though I didn't think anything of it then. The hospital sat back from the main road behind a chain-link fence that had been patched in a few places, with mismatched sections, half hidden by overgrown brush that had crept up over the years since anyone bothered to maintain the grounds. The building itself was larger than I expected from the road, a long, low main structure with the 5 wings branching off it like spokes, and the separate annex building set back further, connected to the main hospital by an enclosed walkway on the 2nd floor. Even in the fading daylight, before my shift technically started, it had a particular kind of stillness to it. The stillness of a place that used to be full of motion and noise and human need, and now wasn't. A stillness that felt less like absence and more like waiting, though I want to be honest and say that I'm probably only describing it that way now, with everything I know in hindsight. At the time, I just thought it looked like a big, ugly, empty building, and I was mostly thinking about how cold it was going to be inside once the sun went down. The outgoing guard met me in the parking lot a little before my shift started. His name was Daryl, an older man, maybe 60, with the kind of weathered, unbothered face you'd expect from someone who'd worked nights for most of his career. He shook my hand, looked at me for a second longer than felt entirely comfortable, and then handed me a ring of keys and a clipboard and started walking toward the front entrance without much preamble, talking as he walked, the way people do when they want to get through something they've said 100 times before without having to think too hard about it. He showed me the guard station first, a small room just off the main lobby that had probably once been an administrative office, now stocked with a folding table, a space heater, a battered office chair, and a bank of monitors hooked up to a security camera system that covered maybe a third of the building, mostly the main entrances and a few of the longer hallways. He walked me through the log sheet, a simple paper form where I was supposed to record the time of each round and initial it. 6 rounds total across the 8-hour shift, roughly every 90 minutes, covering all 5 wings of the main building on a rotating basis, since you couldn't realistically walk the whole structure in any single pass. And then he told me the rules. I remember this part very clearly, because of how strange it felt at the time. The way his voice changed slightly, dropped a register, became more careful. Do the rounds exactly on schedule, he said. Not early, not late. If your round is supposed to start at 11, you start walking at 11, not 10:55, not 11:05. He said this twice, which I noted even then as unusual for someone who'd otherwise been pretty casual about everything else. Don't go into the annex building, he said. The walkway connecting it to the 2nd floor of the main building was supposed to be locked, and it should stay locked, and even if I found it unlocked for some reason, I was not to cross it. The annex wasn't part of the contracted patrol route anyway, he said, so there was no reason I'd ever need to. There was an intercom system, an old one, original to the building, with a panel in the guard station and speaker boxes mounted throughout the hallways. The kind of overhead paging system you'd expect in any hospital from that era. He said it still worked, technically, on its own internal power loop separate from the rest of the building's electrical, which had mostly been shut off except for a few circuits keeping the lights on in occupied areas. If it ever activated, he said, if I ever heard anything come through those speakers, I wasn't supposed to respond to it, wasn't supposed to use the panel to answer back, wasn't even supposed to acknowledge it out loud. Just let it run its course and keep walking. I remember asking him, a little more pointedly than my earlier joke about ghosts, why an intercom system that hadn't served any functional purpose in over a decade would still occasionally activate at all, and he gave me an answer that, at the time, I accepted at face value, and that, in hindsight, strikes me as the kind of careful, technically true but fundamentally evasive answer a person gives when they don't want to lie outright, but also don't want to tell you the whole truth. He said old electrical systems sometimes develop phantom faults, stray current finding unexpected paths through degraded insulation, and that a paging system on its own isolated loop could, theoretically, generate noise or even fragments of sound through nothing more than electromagnetic interference from somewhere else in the building. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, the kind of explanation an electrician might actually give you, and I held on to it for longer than I probably should have, because it let me keep believing, for at least the first several hours of my shift, that everything happening around me had some grounded, mechanical cause, however strange, rather than something I had no framework at all for understanding. I asked him, half joking, whether the building was haunted. He didn't laugh the way I expected him to. He just looked at me for a second and said that he'd worked the rotation there for about 3 weeks before requesting a transfer, and that he wasn't going to tell me what he saw or didn't see, because in his experience telling a new guy what to expect just made him expect it, and expecting things in a building like this was its own kind of problem. He said the rules weren't about ghosts, he said the rules were just good practice in any old building with bad wiring and worse acoustics, and that if I followed them I'd be fine, and if I didn't, that was on me. Then he handed me the keys, told me the night shift ran from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., wished me luck in a tone that didn't sound like he meant it as warmly as the words suggested, and left. I sat alone in that guard station for a while after he drove off, just getting my bearings, looking over the building layout on a laminated floor plan tacked to the wall, getting familiar with the camera feeds. The lobby looked exactly like you'd imagine an abandoned hospital lobby to look. A reception desk with a layer of dust thick enough to write your name in, dead potted plants in the corners, a row of waiting room chairs still bolted in place, facing a wall-mounted television that hadn't worked in years. The lighting in the building ran on a partial circuit, enough to keep the hallways dimly lit without plunging me into total darkness, a kind of perpetual dusk that I'd later come to find more unsettling than actual darkness would have been, because dim light leaves just enough ambiguity for your eyes to fill in the blanks with whatever your mind is already primed to expect. It was while I was getting acquainted with that floor plan, tracing the route of my first round with my finger along the laminated surface, that I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. A section of the building, off to the side of the main structure, connected by that second-floor walkway Daryl had mentioned, labeled simply Annex Behavioral Health, with a smaller printed notation beneath it that had been crossed out with a thick black marker, so thoroughly obscured that I couldn't make out what it originally said, no matter how I angled the overhead light against it. I remember finding that strange in an idle sort of way, the kind of detail you notice and then set aside because you have other, more immediate things to think about, and at the time, with my shift only just beginning, and the building still mostly just a building to me, I didn't think much more of it. I learned more about the hospital's history later, not that night, but in the days afterward, once I'd started trying to make sense of what had happened to me, digging through old newspaper archives and a handful of local history forums where longtime residents occasionally traded stories about the place. What I found painted a picture considerably more complicated than the tidy, official narrative of a hospital simply outliving its usefulness. Mercy Hollow, it turned out, had been the subject of a state investigation in its final years of operation. An investigation into conditions in that same behavioral health annex, prompted by a handful of complaints from former employees about understaffing, about patients left unsupervised for extended periods, about at least one incident, never fully substantiated in any public record I could find, the details deliberately vague in the few newspaper articles that touched on it at all, involving a patient who had gone missing from the annex for the better part of 2 days before being found, unharmed but unable or unwilling to explain where he'd been, in a maintenance corridor that, according to the building's own records, had been sealed off from that section of the building for years. The investigation concluded, eventually, with a handful of administrative penalties and a quiet agreement to close the behavioral health unit entirely well before the rest of the hospital shut its doors, folding what few patients remained into other facilities elsewhere in the region. None of this had been mentioned to me by Carol, or by Daryl, and I don't know whether that was because they genuinely didn't know, or because it was the kind of thing that simply didn't come up in casual conversation about an empty building and a paycheck. But I didn't know any of that yet, not that first night, sitting in the guard station with nothing but a laminated floor plan and a crossed-out label to wonder about. I finished my orientation, checked that the front and rear entrances were locked, confirmed through the camera feed that the second-floor walkway door was closed, and, as far as I could tell from the monitor, secured, and settled in to wait out the last few minutes before my first scheduled round. The first hour was uneventful, in the most literal sense of the word. I logged my arrival, did a walkthrough of the lobby and the nearest corridor just to get a feel for the place before my first official round, found nothing out of the ordinary beyond the ordinary strangeness of an empty hospital. Rooms with their doors standing open onto stripped beds and disconnected monitoring equipment, a nurse's station with a calendar still pinned to a corkboard, faded to the point of illegibility, charting a month from over a decade ago that no one had ever bothered to take down. I remember finding it almost peaceful, in a strange way. There's something about an empty space that used to hold so much human urgency. Birth, death, fear, relief, all of it. Gone quiet, gone still, that felt less haunting to me at first than simply sad. The way an old photograph of strangers can feel sad. A record of lives you'll never know anything else about. My first scheduled round was at 8:30, covering the East Wing, which according to the floor plan had mostly housed general patient rooms and a small physical therapy unit. I walked it exactly the way Daryl had instructed, starting precisely on the half hour, moving at a steady pace down the long central corridor, glancing into rooms as I passed, listening to the particular quality of silence that fills a building like that. A silence with texture to it, the hum of the partial electrical circuit, the occasional creak of settling structure, my own footsteps swallowed up by carpet that had probably been replaced sometime in the 90s and never touched since. It was on that first round that I noticed the first thing that didn't quite sit right with me, though at the time I dismissed it easily enough. One of the patient room doors, which I was fairly sure had been closed when I passed it, walking toward the end of the corridor, was standing open when I came back the other way. I remember stopping in front of it, looking in, finding nothing inside but an empty room, a stripped bed frame, a window with blinds hanging at an angle, nothing that suggested anyone or anything had been in there. I told myself I'd simply misremembered which doors were open and which were closed on the way in, that I hadn't been paying close enough attention, that this was a big building with a lot of identical doors, and it would be easy to lose track. I finished the round, logged it at 8:41, 11 minutes after I started, which felt about right for the distance covered, and went back to the guard station to wait out the next 90 minutes. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I am not, by nature, an anxious person. I've never been someone who gets spooked easily, never been the kid who believed there was something under the bed, never been the adult who flinches at a dark hallway. I say this not to convince you that what happened that night was therefore objectively real. I understand how these stories work. I understand the instinct to establish credibility before asking you to believe something incredible, but because I think it's relevant to how slowly I let myself notice what was happening. A more anxious person might have clocked the wrongness of that night within the first hour and left. It took me considerably longer than that, because I kept finding reasonable explanations, kept talking myself back down, kept choosing the boring answer over the alarming one, right up until the boring answer simply stopped being available to me anymore. The second round was at 10 o'clock, covering the West Wing, which had housed, according to the floor plan, the hospital's surgical recovery rooms and what looked like an old radiology department. This round was where the lights started. I don't mean they went out. I mean they flickered, in the specific, particular way fluorescent lights flicker when they're failing, a kind of stutter, on, off, on, sometimes settling back into a steady burn, sometimes dimming briefly before recovering. This happened at 3 or 4 points along the corridor, never in a pattern I could identify, never consistently in the same fixtures twice. I told myself, reasonably, that this was an old building with old wiring on a partial circuit that probably hadn't been properly maintained in over a decade, and that flickering lights were about as unremarkable a phenomenon as you could ask for in a place like this. I made a note of it on my log, mostly so I could mention it to Carol or whoever handled facilities issues, and kept walking. It was near the end of that same round, close to the radiology department, that I heard the sound for the first time. I want to describe it as precisely as I can, because I've spent 3 years trying to find better language for it, and I'm still not sure I have. It was a kind of soft, irregular tapping, not rhythmic enough to be mechanical, not loud enough to be a door slamming or a piece of equipment falling. More like, and I know how this is going to sound, more like someone tapping a single fingernail against a hard surface, slowly, almost thoughtfully, somewhere off to my left, behind one of the closed doors along that corridor. I stopped walking. I listened. It continued for maybe 4 or 5 seconds and then stopped entirely, and the corridor went back to its ordinary hum of distant electrical current and my own breathing, which I noticed, in that moment, had gotten a little faster than I wanted it to be. I told myself it was the building settling. Old buildings make sounds, especially at night, especially when the temperature drops and different materials contract at different rates. I'd heard wood and metal do strange things in cold weather before, in other buildings, on other jobs. I gave myself that explanation, accepted it, and finished my round, logging it at 10:13. The hours between rounds were, in some ways, harder than the rounds themselves, because that's when I had nothing to do but sit in the small pool of lamplight in the guard station and listen to a building that I was increasingly aware was not entirely silent. I'd hear things in the distance, a soft groan of settling structure, the occasional far-off clatter that I assumed was some loose piece of equipment shifting somewhere, once what I was fairly sure was a small animal scurrying through a wall cavity, which actually came as something of a relief, because at least a mouse or a raccoon was an explanation I could hold on to without much effort. It was during that gap, sometime around 11, that I first noticed the smell. I want to be careful describing it, because smell is such a slippery, suggestible sense, the kind that's easiest to talk yourself into or out of depending on what you already expect to find. But it came on gradually, the way a smell does when a draft carries it toward you from somewhere else in a building. A faint, antiseptic sharpness underneath something sweeter and less pleasant. The specific combination that anyone who has spent time in hospitals will recognize without being able to fully name it. The smell of cleaning chemicals layered over something organic that the chemicals were meant to be masking. I checked the guard station door, found it closed, checked the vents in the ceiling, found nothing obviously circulating air through them, given how much of the building's systems had been shut down years before. The smell faded after a few minutes, the way it had come, and I logged nothing about it, because at the time I genuinely couldn't decide whether I'd actually smelled anything at all, or whether my mind, sitting alone in a dim, empty hospital at 11 o'clock at night, had simply manufactured the sensation out of suggestion and expectation. I've changed my mind about that more than once in the years since. There was also, in that same stretch of waiting, a stretch of nearly 90 minutes that I now recognize as the last genuinely calm period of my entire shift. A moment where I caught myself, almost without meaning to, doing the math on how much money this job would let me save if I stuck with it through the winter, thinking about ordinary things, rent and groceries and whether I needed new tires before the cold weather really set in. The kind of mundane mental drift that only happens when a person feels, even briefly, that nothing around them requires their full attention. I want to mention this not because anything happened during it, but because I think it matters, in hindsight. As a kind of marker, the last point in the night where I still fundamentally believed the building was just a building. The last point before that belief started, slowly and then very suddenly, to come apart. My third round was at 11:30, and this is where I want to slow down, because this is where things started to genuinely shift for me, where the easy explanations started running out faster than I could generate new ones. The 11:30 round covered the north wing, which the floor plan identified as the hospital's former pediatric unit, smaller than the other wings, a single shorter corridor with rooms on either side, decorated, faintly, even after all these years, with the ghost of a brighter color scheme than the rest of the building. Pale yellows and blues, a few patches of wall where you could still make out the outline of decals that had long since peeled away. There's something particular about an abandoned pediatric ward, something that sits differently than the rest of an abandoned hospital, and I felt it the moment I stepped into that corridor, a kind of heaviness I hadn't felt in the other wings, though I want to be careful here, because I recognize that knowing what kind of ward I was walking into probably primed my mind to feel something it might not have otherwise. About halfway down that corridor, I found a child's drawing taped to the inside window of one of the rooms, facing out into the hallway the way kids sometimes do, displaying their work for anyone passing by. It was a crayon drawing, faded but legible, depicting what looked like a stick figure family standing in front of a simple house, the son a yellow scribble in the corner, the kind of drawing you'd find in 1,000 pediatric wards across the country. A small piece of someone's childhood left behind, probably for years, untouched, undisturbed, exactly the kind of detail you'd expect to find in a building like this and feel a brief, sad pang about before moving on. I want to be clear that I noticed this drawing on my way in. I did not notice it on my way out, 4 or 5 minutes later, walking back down the same corridor, because it wasn't there anymore. The window was empty. There was no tape residue, no drawing fallen to the floor beneath it, nothing to suggest it had simply come loose and dropped. It was just gone, in the time it took me to walk to the end of a 30-foot corridor and back. I stood in front of that window for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only 30 seconds or so, running through every reasonable explanation I could think of. A draft maybe, though I couldn't account for where a draft strong enough to dislodge taped paper and then carry it somewhere I couldn't immediately see would have come from in a sealed interior corridor. A trick of memory maybe. Had I actually seen it on the way in, or had I imagined it, my mind filling in a detail that felt appropriate for the setting. But I remembered it too specifically for that explanation to feel honest. I remembered the yellow sun. I remembered the slightly lopsided roof on the stick figure house. You don't hallucinate that level of specific, mundane detail, not in my experience, not without some chemical assistance I hadn't had that night. I want to mention one more small thing about that corridor, something I almost left out of this telling because it seems, on its own, too minor to matter, except that I think it matters precisely because of how minor it is. How easily it could have passed without my noticing it at all. As I stood there in front of that empty window, I became aware, gradually, of a faint draft moving past my ankles, cold, low to the ground, the kind of draft you'd associate with a gap beneath a door rather than anything coming from above. I crouched down, instinctively, to check the gap beneath the nearest door, and found nothing unusual there. No obvious source for the draft, the door fitting its frame about as well as you'd expect from a building this old. But the draft continued, intermittently, for the remainder of the time I stood in that corridor, brushing past my ankles every few seconds in a pattern that, the longer I paid attention to it, began to feel less like the ordinary, random movement of air, and more like something with a rhythm to it. Something almost like breathing, though I want to be honest that I cannot say with any confidence whether that impression was something genuinely present in the physical world, or something my own escalating fear had simply begun layering onto an ordinary, explainable draft. I did something I'm not proud of, in hindsight, though I understand why I did it. I didn't investigate further. I didn't open any of the doors along that corridor to look for the drawing. Didn't check whether it had simply blown into one of the rooms. I logged the round at 11:41, 6 minutes after I should have, the first time I'd been late, and I walked back to the guard station faster than I would normally walk, and I sat down, and I noticed that my hands weren't entirely steady, and I told myself, with a kind of forced, deliberate firmness, that I was letting the building get to me, that I was a grown man with a job to do, and that I needed to settle down before my next round. I spent the next half hour or so trying, with limited success, to talk myself back into some version of normalcy. I made instant coffee with the little electric kettle Daryl had left behind in the guard station, found the powdered creamer gone stale, and used it anyway, sat with the warm cup between my hands, and tried to think through the missing drawing the way I imagined a more rational person would, someone less prone to letting an old building and a long night work on his nerves. I came up with a list of possible explanations, even wrote a few of them down on the back of the log sheet, a habit I've always had when I'm trying to make sense of something, the physical act of writing it out, somehow making the thoughts feel more manageable, more contained. A draft from somewhere I hadn't identified. A loose adhesive that had simply given way at exactly the wrong, coincidental moment. My own memory, playing tricks on me in low light and rising stress. None of these explanations, written out in my own handwriting in that small, cold room, felt as convincing as I wanted them to, but I held on to them anyway, because the alternative explanation, the one I wasn't ready to write down at all, was so much worse than any of these that I needed something, anything, to stand between me and it. I checked the cameras again during that stretch, cycling through the feeds I did have access to, watching empty hallway after empty hallway resolve into grainy, low-light stillness, nothing moving, nothing out of place, the ordinary, unremarkable footage of an ordinary, unremarkable empty building, which should have reassured me and somehow didn't, because I kept finding myself searching the edges of each frame, the shadowed corners just outside the camera's effective range, half expecting and half dreading that I'd catch something there, some shape resolving out of the darkness at the periphery of what the lens could actually capture. It was during that period, sometime close to midnight, that I noticed something on one of the feeds that I genuinely cannot explain even now, something smaller and stranger than anything that came before or after it, the kind of detail that doesn't fit neatly into the story's escalating arc, but that has stayed with me regardless, the way odd, inexplicable details sometimes do. On the camera covering the central wing's main corridor, a section of the building I hadn't yet walked that night, and wouldn't reach until my 2:30 round, I watched, for just a few seconds, what looked like condensation forming on the inside of the lens, a faint fogging that bloomed and then cleared, the way glass fogs when warm breath meets a cold surface. There was no logical source for that kind of condensation, no warm body anywhere near that camera as far as I could tell, no heating vent positioned to create that effect. I watched the feed for several more minutes after that, waiting for it to happen again, and it didn't, and eventually I made myself stop watching, because staring at a static image of an empty hallway, waiting for something to happen, was its own particular kind of torment, one that I think did almost as much to fray my nerves that night as any of the things I actually witnessed firsthand. It was during that gap before my fourth round, sometime around midnight, that the intercom activated for the first time. I'd almost forgotten Daryl's instruction about it, honestly, in the rush of everything else that had already happened that night, and so when the overhead speaker in the guard station crackled to life, that particular hiss of static you get from an old paging system warming up, I actually felt a strange flicker of relief, some instinct telling me it might be Carol, or some kind of automated system check, something ordinary and explainable. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, not in any way I could parse as language. It was more like a long, low exhale, the kind of sound a person makes when they're settling into a chair after a long day, except stretched far longer than any human breath could naturally last, and underneath it, very faint, almost beneath the threshold of hearing, something that might have been a voice trying to form words and not quite managing it, a kind of garbled underwater murmur that rose and fell without ever resolving into anything I could understand. I remembered Daryl's instruction immediately, viscerally, the way you remember a warning, right at the moment you most need it. Don't respond. Don't use the panel. Just let it run its course. I sat absolutely still in that folding chair, staring at the speaker grill mounted in the corner of the ceiling, my hand hovering instinctively near the intercom panel on the desk before I forced myself to pull it back, and I waited. The sound continued for almost a full minute, that long exhale, that murmuring undercurrent, and then it cut off, abruptly, mid-breath, the static dying with it, the room dropping back into its ordinary, ambient hum. I sat there for a long time after that. I won't pretend otherwise. I sat there long enough that I nearly missed my 1 o'clock round entirely, catching myself with maybe 4 minutes to spare, forcing myself up out of that chair through what felt like genuine physical effort, the kind of resistance your body puts up when every instinct it has is telling it to stay exactly where it is. The 1 o'clock round covered the South Wing, the hospital's former emergency department, the largest single section of the building, a wide corridor opening into what had once been the main triage and treatment area, a space full of disconnected equipment racks, curtained bays with the curtains still hanging, faded and dusty, around empty treatment beds. I walked it more cautiously than I had walked any previous round, more aware of every sound, every shadow, every flicker of the failing lights, and it was in that wide treatment area, standing near what I think had once been the nurses' central station, that I saw the thing I still have the hardest time talking about, the thing that, more than anything else that happened that night, is the reason I quit. I want to walk through the lead-up to that moment carefully, because I think the details that came before it matter, because nothing about that emergency department gave me any specific warning of what I was about to see, and I think that absence of warning is itself part of what made it so unbearable. The room was large, larger than any other single space I'd walked through that night, the ceiling higher than I expected, the kind of architecture you'd associate with a working emergency department designed to move a lot of people and equipment quickly through a confined space. The curtained bays ran along both walls, 8 or 10 of them, most with their curtains drawn back, a few still closed, and I remember making a conscious decision, walking into that room, not to look behind any of the closed curtains, a decision that felt, at the time, like simple efficiency, like staying on task, and that I now understand, with the clarity of hindsight, was actually a decision born entirely out of fear, a fear I hadn't yet allowed myself to name directly, even as it was already shaping my behavior. I saw a figure at the far end of the room, standing near one of the curtained bays, where the partial lighting circuit didn't quite reach, leaving that corner in a deeper kind of dimness than the rest of the space. I want to be careful and precise here, because I've turned this image over in my mind more times than I can count, trying to find the version of it I can fully trust, and what I keep coming back to is this. It was upright, roughly human in proportion, standing with a kind of stillness that didn't read as natural, not the stillness of someone standing quietly, but the stillness of something that simply wasn't moving in the way a living thing moves, without the small, constant adjustments, weight shifting, breathing, the almost imperceptible sway of balance that even a person trying very hard to stand still will still exhibit. It was just there, fixed, like a photograph of a person rather than a person. I didn't call out. I want to be honest about that too, because in the story version of this, the version you tell at a party, the narrator usually says something, demands to know who's there, asserts themselves into the moment. I didn't do that. I stood frozen for what was probably only 2 or 3 seconds, but felt considerably longer, and in that frozen moment, the figure was simply gone, not moved, not retreated into shadow, gone, the way the drawing had been gone, an absence where a presence had been, with no transitional movement I could account for in between. I left that round unfinished. I want to be honest about that as well. I did not walk the remainder of the south wing. I turned and walked back the way I'd come, faster than a walk, not quite a run, and I logged the round anyway when I reached the guard station, because some part of my brain, even in that state, was still operating on the procedural autopilot the job had built into me over the preceding weeks, and I think, looking back, that the inaccuracy of that log entry, the fact that I marked a round complete that I hadn't actually finished, is the detail that bothers me most when I think about what might have happened if I'd kept walking that corridor instead of turning back. I want to slow down here because I think it's important to describe, as honestly as I can, what it actually felt like in those first few minutes after I got back to the guard station, because I think the fear itself changed shape somewhere in that stretch of time, became something different from the kind of fear I'd been carrying through the earlier rounds. Up until that point, everything had been ambiguous enough that I could hold 2 explanations in my head at once, the mundane one and the impossible one, and let myself lean toward the mundane one out of simple necessity, because the alternative was too large to sit with comfortably. But standing in that treatment bay, watching something not move the way a living thing moves, and then watching it simply cease to be there at all, had closed off the mundane explanation in a way nothing before it had managed to do. I sat in that folding chair with my hands pressed flat against my knees, trying to control my breathing, and I remember thinking, with a kind of detached, almost clinical clarity that surprised me even as I was having the thought, that I was no longer trying to figure out what was happening in this building. I was simply trying to figure out how to survive the next 2 hours of being inside it. I considered, seriously, calling the police, and got as far as pulling my phone out of my pocket before stopping myself, turning the idea over, trying to imagine how that call would go. I imagined a dispatcher asking me to describe the emergency, and I imagined myself trying to explain that I'd seen something standing unnaturally still in an empty room, and then watched it disappear, and I understood, with a kind of bleak, exhausted clarity, that there was no version of that conversation that didn't end with someone showing up to find an empty hospital and a security guard who appeared to be having some kind of episode. I put the phone away. I told myself, again, that I simply needed to make it to 3 a.m., that the rules Daryl had given me existed for a reason I didn't need to understand in order to benefit from following them, and that the safest thing I could do was sit exactly where I was, in the one room in that entire building that had a door I could lock, and wait out the clock. It was during that waiting period, somewhere around 1:30, that I made the decision that I now understand was the actual turning point of the night. The moment where everything that came after became, in some sense, inevitable. I decided to check the security camera feeds, the bank of monitors covering the portions of the building under camera surveillance, partly out of a desperate need to feel some kind of control over what was happening, some way of seeing, without having to physically walk back out into those corridors. I scrolled back through the recorded footage from the past few hours, looking for anything that might explain what I'd just seen, half hoping to find nothing at all, which would let me write the whole night off as nerves and bad lighting and an overactive imagination working on a body that hadn't slept properly in days. I found something instead. On the camera covering the main second-floor corridor, the one that led toward the enclosed walkway connecting to the annex building, the one Daryl had specifically told me never to cross, I found a stretch of footage, time-stamped at around 12:45, roughly the same time I'd been standing in the guard station, listening to that long exhale come through the intercom, where the door to that walkway, which I had confirmed locked at the start of my shift during my initial walkthrough, was standing open. I sat with that footage for a long time, rewinding it, watching it again, looking for the moment the door had opened, looking for anything, a draft, a malfunctioning lock mechanism, anything that might explain it. The footage simply cut from the door closed to the door open between two consecutive frames. No gradual movement, no visible cause. The kind of discontinuity that, on any other night, I would have assumed was a glitch in the recording system. I didn't assume that anymore. By that point in the night, I had run out of room for assuming things. I checked the time. It was nearly 1:45. My next round, the fifth of 6, was scheduled for 2:30, and it was supposed to cover the central wing and the main lobby. Nowhere near that second-floor walkway, nowhere near the annex. I told myself I could simply do that round as planned, avoid the area entirely, finish out the shift, and report the open door to Carol in the morning, along with everything else. Let someone else decide what to do about it. I told myself this with as much conviction as I could manage, and some part of me even believed it, for a little while. But I kept watching the monitor. I kept it on that second-floor corridor feed instead of cycling through the others the way I normally would. Some compulsion I couldn't fully explain to myself, keeping my eyes fixed on that open doorway, that dim rectangle of deeper darkness beyond it, where the annex walkway began. And at some point, I couldn't tell you exactly when because I'd lost track of time in a way that frightens me even now to think about, I saw something pass through the frame. It wasn't there, and then it was. The way the figure in the south wing had been there and then wasn't. That same quality of discontinuous presence that I'd already, by that point, started to understand as the building's particular signature, the way it seemed to operate outside the rules of continuous motion that everything else in the physical world obeys. It crossed from the edge of the frame nearest the walkway door toward the camera, slowly, and I want to describe what I saw as carefully and honestly as I can, because I've thought about this image more than any other single thing in my life, before or since. It looked, at first glance, like a person in old hospital scrubs. The pale green-gray color faded almost to nothing, moving with a slow, deliberate gait down the center of that corridor. But the proportions were wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Something about the length of the limbs relative to the torso, something about the way the head sat on the shoulders. Not grotesquely wrong, not monstrous in any way I could point to specifically, just wrong in the way a reflection in a slightly warped mirror is wrong, technically humanoid but somehow, fundamentally, not quite a match for anything that should exist. It moved toward the camera for several seconds, and then, just before it would have passed close enough for the resolution to give me anything more specific to look at, the feed cut to static, a sudden burst of visual noise that lasted maybe 2 seconds before the picture returned, showing the corridor empty again, the walkway door now closed, exactly as it had been at the start of my shift, as though none of it had happened at all. I turned off the monitor. I sat in the dark for a moment, just breathing, trying to organize my thoughts into something resembling a plan, and what I landed on, eventually, was this. I would finish the night exactly by the rules Daryl had given me, exact timing on the rounds. No deviation from the assigned route, no engagement with the intercom, and under no circumstances would I go anywhere near that second-floor walkway, regardless of what I'd just watched on that monitor, regardless of how badly some part of me wanted to understand what I was looking at. There is a particular kind of curiosity that fear doesn't extinguish so much as it sharpens, and I want to admit, honestly, that some small, unwelcome part of me, even in that state, even with my hands still trembling slightly against the edge of the desk, wanted to walk up to that second floor and see for myself what was on the other side of that walkway door. I think it's the same impulse that makes people slow down at the scene of an accident, The same impulse that makes a person press on a bruise just to feel exactly how much it hurts. I did not act on it. I want to be very clear about that, because I think the only reason I'm alive to tell this story at all is that I didn't act on it. That whatever instinct kept Daryl from ever explaining exactly what he saw in 3 weeks on that rotation was the same instinct that kept me rooted to that folding chair instead of climbing those stairs. I made it through the 2:30 round without incident, or at least without anything I'd call an incident by that point in the night, which says something about how thoroughly my baseline for normal had shifted in the preceding hours. The lights flickered a little. I heard, once, very faintly, what might have been a child's laughter somewhere on a floor above me. Brief, cut off almost as soon as I registered it, and I did not investigate, did not even let myself fully process it until I was back in the guard station with the door closed behind me. I logged the round on time, 2:30 exactly, and sat down to wait out the final 90 minutes of my shift, the home stretch, the part where I genuinely believed, against everything that had happened, that I might simply make it to 3 a.m. and walk out of that building and never come back, and that would be the end of it. In hindsight, I think that 90-minute stretch was, in its own way, the cruelest part of the entire night. Crueler even than what came after, because it offered me something dangerously close to hope. The building seemed to settle, in those final minutes, into something almost like ordinary stillness. The lights stopped flickering. The temperature, which had been dropping steadily and unevenly throughout the shift, leveled off into something merely uncomfortable rather than alarming. I let myself believe, for a little while, that whatever had been active in that building that night had, for whatever reason, finished what it was doing, that I had simply weathered the worst of it and would be allowed to leave intact. I think now that this calm was not an accident, not a coincidence of timing, but something closer to a held breath, the particular quiet that comes before the loudest part of any story, though I had no way of knowing that at the time, sitting in that chair, watching the clock tick toward 3, allowing myself, against every piece of evidence I'd gathered over the preceding 7 hours, to feel something almost like relief. I want to tell you what happened during that final stretch as precisely as I can, because it's the part of the story that, when I do tell it, people seem to find hardest to accept, and I understand why. Because even now, having lived through it, there's a part of me that struggles to fully accept it too. At some point around 2:50, 10 minutes before my final round was scheduled to begin, the intercom activated again. I had been braced for this, in some way, ever since the first time it had happened, some instinct telling me it wasn't a one-time occurrence, and I sat in that folding chair, staring at the speaker, prepared to simply wait it out the way I had before. But this time was different. This time, underneath the static, underneath that same long, drawn-out exhale, I heard something that resolved, for just a moment, into something I could almost call language. A voice, distorted, layered with that underwater murmur, said what I am as certain as I can be of anything said that night was my name. Not a generic greeting, not a garbled approximation of a word. My actual first name, spoken slowly, almost questioningly, the way you'd say someone's name if you weren't entirely sure they were who you thought they were, checking, testing the syllables against some memory or expectation. I did not respond. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because everything Daryl had told me, every instinct I had left by that point, was screaming at me not to. I sat frozen, my hand pressed flat against my own mouth, without my having consciously decided to put it there, and I waited for it to pass, the way it had passed before, and after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, it did. The static cut out, the speaker went silent, the room settled back into its ordinary hum. But something had changed in that room, something I couldn't immediately name, and it took me a few seconds, sitting there in the aftermath of that silence, to understand what it was. The temperature had dropped again, sharply, faster than it had at any other point in the night, and underneath the cold, that same antiseptic and something sweeter smell I'd noticed hours earlier had returned, stronger now, thick enough that I found myself breathing through my mouth without consciously deciding to. I checked the clock. It was 2:58. My final round was scheduled for 3, but with the building's reach exceeding what could realistically be patrolled in the minutes I had left before my contracted shift technically ended, the route for that last round had always been the shortest of the 6, covering only the immediate lobby area and the nearest section of the central wing. A kind of formality more than a genuine patrol, the last box to check before handing off to whoever covered the day shift, or, in my case, before simply locking up and leaving for good. I want to tell you I did that round exactly on schedule, exactly as instructed, but I can't, because what actually happened is that I sat in that chair for almost 4 full minutes past 3 o'clock, unable to make myself stand up, unable to make myself walk back out into that building one more time, even for the short, simple route that final round required. I have wondered, many times since, whether those 4 minutes mattered, whether the building was, in some sense, waiting for me to follow the rule precisely, and whether breaking it, even by accident, even out of simple human fear rather than any deliberate defiance, was what opened the door to what happened next. When I finally forced myself up, it was 3:04. I walked out of the guard station into the lobby, and the first thing I noticed was that the temperature had dropped further still, sharply, the kind of cold that has weight to it, that you feel pressing against your skin rather than simply registering as a number on a thermostat. The lights in the lobby, which had been holding steady all night on their partial circuit, were flickering now in a sustained, rapid pattern, unlike anything I'd seen earlier in the shift, fast enough that the room took on a strobing, stuttering quality, fragments of motion, caught and frozen, and caught again. And in those fragments, in the brief flashes of illumination between the stutters of darkness, I saw movement at the far end of the lobby, near the entrance to the central wing corridor, the same kind of discontinuous, wrong-proportioned movement I'd seen on the monitor hours before. Except now it wasn't confined to a screen. Now it was somewhere between 30 and 40 feet away from me in physical space, closing that distance in a way I could not properly track because of how the strobing light fractured my perception of its motion into disconnected stills. I want to try to describe what that fractured perception actually felt like, because I think it's the part of the experience that has stayed with me most vividly, more than any single visual detail. It wasn't like watching something approach in a normal, continuous way, the way you'd watch a person walk toward you across a room. It was like being shown a series of photographs in rapid succession, each one capturing the figure slightly closer than the last, with no sense of the motion connecting one frame to the next, so that my mind, trying desperately to process what it was seeing, kept registering not movement, but a series of discrete, escalating proximities, each flash of light revealing a version of the thing that was simply nearer than the version before it, as though distance itself had become something that could be skipped rather than crossed. In the brief instance between those flashes, in the total darkness that came each time the strobing cut out completely, I became aware of something else, something I have never been able to fit comfortably into the rest of the story, but that I owe it to myself, and to you, to include here rather than smooth over. In that darkness, just before each return of light, I thought I could feel temperature change against the side of my face nearest the central wing. A brief, localized warmth, gone as quickly as it arrived. The kind of warmth you'd feel if someone leaned close enough to speak directly into your ear without actually touching you, close enough that you'd feel their breath before you heard their voice. No voice ever came. Just that warmth, that proximity, arriving and vanishing in rhythm with the strobing lights, as though whatever was crossing that lobby toward me was using the darkness between flashes not merely to move, but to draw nearer in some more intimate, more immediate way than simple distance could account for. I am not going to pretend I handled this with any kind of composure. I ran back toward the front entrance, away from the central wing, away from whatever was crossing that lobby toward me, and I remember very little of the next several seconds with any real clarity, just a kind of tunnel of motion and adrenaline, and the specific, animal terror of a body operating entirely on instinct, with no input from anything resembling rational thought. I remember the front doors, which I had locked at the start of my shift, refusing to open for one horrible, eternal second before the mechanism gave way, and I was through them, out into the cold night air, across the parking lot, into my car, locking the doors before I'd even fully processed that I'd made it outside at all. I sat in that car for a long time before I trusted myself to drive, watching the front of that building through my windshield, watching for any sign of movement in the windows, the lobby lights still flickering visibly even from that distance, and then, abruptly, going dark entirely, the whole front face of the hospital dropping into a uniform black that felt, somehow, more final and more frightening than the strobing had been, as though something had simply decided the performance was over. I sat there long enough for my breathing to return to something approaching normal, long enough for the heater in my car to finally start putting out warm air, long enough that the first faint gray light of dawn had begun to soften the edges of the sky behind the building before I finally trusted my hands enough to put the car in drive. I drove home with every window cracked despite the cold, some instinct telling me I needed moving air against my face to stay anchored to the present moment, to the ordinary, physical world of a car and a road and streetlights, rather than slip back into whatever state of mind I'd been in for the better part of the preceding hour. I did not go back inside to retrieve anything I might have left in the guard station, did not call Carol that night, did not do anything except drive, shaking, both hands locked on the wheel, until I reached my apartment, where I sat in my own living room with every light on, until the sun came up. I called Carol the next morning and told her I quit, effective immediately, and when she asked why, with the particular weary patience of someone who had clearly fielded this exact call before, I found I couldn't actually explain it to her in any way that felt adequate, and so I just said the job wasn't a good fit, and she said she understood, and that was the end of my employment with that company. I never went back to Mercy Hollow. In the weeks that followed, I found myself doing things I'm not entirely proud of, the kind of compulsive research that I think anyone who has lived through something inexplicable eventually gives into. Some need to either find an explanation or at least find evidence that someone else had encountered something similar, that I wasn't simply losing my mind in some slow, private way that no one around me had noticed yet. I found Daryl's number through a mutual contact at the security company and called him once, late at night, and he picked up but said very little, confirming only that, yes, he'd heard the intercom say his own name too, during his third week on the rotation, and that this was the reason he'd requested the transfer, and that he didn't particularly want to talk about it further, and I understood, in a way I wouldn't have understood before that night, exactly why he'd said that to me, and I didn't push. I found, eventually, two other names, former guards who had worked brief stints at Mercy Hollow in the years before I ever took the job, both of whom had also left abruptly, both of whom, when I managed to track them down through old social media profiles and a few cautious, exploratory messages, either declined to respond at all or responded with brief, guarded answers that confirmed just enough to tell me I wasn't imagining things without offering any further detail. The kind of careful non-answers people give when they've decided that talking about something only feeds it, gives it more permanence in the world than silence would. I have driven past Mercy Hollow exactly once since that night, almost 2 years later, on a route that took me near that part of the county for unrelated reasons, and I did not slow down, did not look at it longer than I absolutely had to, just enough to confirm it was still standing, still empty, still waiting for whatever the development company eventually decided to do with it, which, as far as I know, has still never happened. The fence looked the same. The chain link patches were still there, maybe a little more rusted than I remembered. From the road, in the daylight, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. An old, abandoned building, sad and ordinary. The kind of place you drive past 100 times without ever once thinking about what might still be inside it. I want to tell you a little about what the months immediately after that night looked like for me, because I think it matters to the shape of the story as a whole, and because I think people who haven't lived through something like this tend to imagine that an experience that intense simply resolves itself, fades into a strange memory you can set down and walk away from. It didn't work that way for me, not for a long time. I had trouble sleeping for the better part of 2 months, not because I was actively afraid of anything specific in my own apartment, but because my body seemed to have learned, on some level beneath conscious thought, to associate the hours between midnight and 3 a.m. with a kind of vigilance I couldn't simply switch off. I'd find myself awake at irregular hours, listening to my own apartment the way I'd learned to listen to that hospital, cataloging every settling creak, every distant sound from a neighbor's unit, with a hyper-attentiveness that exhausted me even as I couldn't stop doing it. I went to a doctor, eventually, mostly at the insistence of my sister, who noticed I'd lost weight and seemed distracted in a way that worried her, though I never told her the actual reason, told her instead some vague, half-true story about stress from the job loss and the difficulty of finding steady work, which wasn't entirely a lie, just an incomplete version of the truth. The doctor diagnosed something in the general neighborhood of an anxiety disorder, prescribed something to help me sleep, suggested I consider talking to someone, and I did, eventually, see a therapist for a handful of sessions, though I never told her the real story either. Not the whole of it. Just enough of the surface details. A stressful, frightening night at a former job, an unspecified trauma I wasn't ready to discuss in detail, to let her help me with the parts of the aftermath I could actually articulate, without sounding, to my own ears, like someone in the grip of a complete break from reality. It was during that period, gradually, in fits and starts, that I started doing the research I mentioned earlier, the newspaper archives, the local history forums, the slow, careful work of trying to understand what that building actually was, beneath the surface explanation I'd been given when I took the job. I want to share a little more of what I found, because I think it adds a dimension to the story that I didn't have access to on the night itself, and because I think it's part of why the experience has never fully released its grip on me, even all these years later. The investigation into the Behavioral Health Annex, the one I mentioned finding records of, included testimony, buried deep in a county records archive, that took me the better part of a month of patient, persistent requests to even access, from a former orderly who had worked in that unit during its final 2 years of operation. His testimony, given as part of the official inquiry, described a pattern of incidents he characterized, in careful, clinical language clearly chosen by whatever attorney had prepared him for the proceeding, as unexplained patient relocations. Instances where patients confined to that unit would be found, during routine bed checks, in locations within the annex that should have been inaccessible to them given the unit's security protocols, sometimes in rooms that had been sealed off entirely for renovation, sometimes, in 2 separate documented instances, in a section of basement corridor that connected the annex to the original 1950s portion of the hospital, a section that had been officially closed and structurally sealed off nearly a decade before either incident occurred. The orderly's testimony went on to describe something else, something the inquiry's official findings ultimately characterized, dismissively, as likely attributable to staff fatigue and the challenging nature of overnight observation duties in a high-acuity unit. But that, reading his actual words on the page, struck me as describing something considerably stranger than ordinary fatigue. He testified that on multiple occasions, patients who had been sedated and were not, by any reasonable medical assessment, capable of independent movement, were nonetheless found relocated, sometimes considerable distances from their assigned rooms, with no record in the unit's logs of any staff member having moved them, and no consistent explanation offered by the patients themselves, several of whom, according to his testimony, simply could not recall how they had come to be, wherever they were found, describing the experience, when pressed, in language the orderly found difficult to forget, even years later when he gave that testimony, Several of them used the same phrase, independently of one another as far as he could determine, describing a sensation of having been led somewhere by someone they could not see, someone who they nonetheless felt certain had been walking just behind them, close enough to feel, the entire way. I don't share this to suggest that I've found some definitive explanation for what happened to me that night. I want to be honest that I haven't, and I'm not sure I ever will. And I've made a kind of uneasy peace with that uncertainty, the same way I think anyone has to make peace with anything genuinely unresolved in their life eventually, simply by living alongside it rather than waiting for it to resolve. But I share it because it told me something I needed to know, something that, strange as it sounds, brought me a measure of comfort even as it confirmed that the building's strangeness predated me, predated my single night there, predated even its closure as a functioning hospital. Whatever I experienced that night wasn't something that arrived because of me, wasn't something I had somehow summoned or triggered through any action of my own. It was already there. It had been there for years, possibly decades, manifesting in different forms to different people who had the misfortune of spending enough time within those walls to notice it. And I was simply the latest in what I now understand to be a long, quiet line of people who walked into that building not knowing what it actually was, and walked back out again changed, in ways both subtle and impossible to fully explain to anyone who hadn't shared the experience. I think about Daryl sometimes, about the careful, deliberate way he gave me those rules without ever fully explaining why they mattered, and I understand now, in a way I couldn't have understood standing in that parking lot on my first evening, exactly what kind of restraint that took, how much he must have wanted to warn me more directly, and how much he must have understood, from his own 3 weeks on that rotation, that a more direct warning wouldn't have actually helped, that some things have to be lived through to be believed, that the rules themselves were the only gift he could actually give me, a kind of inherited protocol passed down through whatever chain of guards had worked that building before either of us, each of them learning just enough to survive their own assigned nights and pass along the bare minimum needed to help the next person survive theirs too, without ever fully explaining the thing the rules were actually protecting against, because explaining it, I think, was never really possible in the first place. I think, too, about the 2 former guards I tracked down, the ones who gave me careful, guarded non-answers rather than any real detail, and I no longer feel any frustration toward them for that reticence, the way I did at the time, when I was still desperate for someone, anyone, to confirm what I'd experienced in language plain enough to let me finally stop doubting my own memory of that night. I understand now that their silence wasn't evasion. It was its own kind of mercy, both toward themselves and toward me, an instinct that talking about it too directly, too often, gave it a kind of permanence and presence in the world, in their own minds, that silence somehow didn't. I've come, slowly, to adopt something like that same instinct myself, which is part of why I've only told this story twice before tonight, and why, even now, telling it as completely as I'm telling it here, I find myself wanting to soften certain details, round certain edges, leave certain things slightly vaguer than I actually remember them, as though precision itself were a kind of risk. There is one more thing I want to tell you before I finish, the thing I mentioned at the very start, the detail that has never stopped following me, 3 years on, regardless of how much distance I've otherwise managed to put between myself and that night. I told you that this story still wakes me up sometimes, at the same hour, every time, and I want to end by telling you what that hour is and what happens when I wake. It is always 2:58 in the morning, the exact minute the intercom said my name. I don't know why my body has fixed on that specific minute rather than any other moment from that night, but it has, with a precision that feels less like coincidence and more like some kind of appointment I never agreed to keep. I wake up, every time, with the absolute certainty, for just a few seconds before my rational mind reasserts itself, that I am not alone in the room, that something is standing very close to the bed, close enough that if I reached out I would touch it, and in those few seconds, before the feeling passes and the room resolves back into its ordinary, empty shape, I sometimes think I can still hear it, very faintly, underneath the silence of my own bedroom, that same long, drawn-out exhale, waiting, patiently, the way it must have been waiting in that building for years, before I ever walked through its doors, for someone to finally answer back. I want to describe what those few seconds actually feel like, because I think the word certainty undersells it, doesn't quite capture the particular texture of the experience. It isn't a thought, exactly, not something that arrives in language the way most of my waking experience does. It's closer to a physical sensation, a pressure in the room that has shape and weight and proximity, the unmistakable feeling of being observed by something positioned just close enough that the observation itself feels less like being watched and more like being attended to, the way you might attend to something you've been waiting a long time to find. And then, every time, within a handful of seconds, it passes. The room settles back into its ordinary geometry. The streetlight through my blinds resumes its familiar pattern across the ceiling, and I'm left lying there in the dark, with my heart going too fast, and the absolute, useless certainty that I will never be able to fully explain what just happened to anyone who wasn't there, because I wasn't fully able to explain it to myself either, not in any way that held up once the sun came up, and the ordinary demands of the day reasserted themselves. I've tried over the years different strategies for managing it. For a while I kept the television on low through the night, the murmur of some old sitcom rerun running in the background, hoping the ambient noise might keep me from surfacing into that particular hour with such sharp, unwelcome clarity. It helped, a little, for a while, though I noticed eventually that I'd started waking at 2:58, regardless of what was playing, as though the hour itself, rather than the silence, was the actual trigger, some internal clock that had been set that night and had never since reset itself back to whatever ordinary rhythm it followed before. I tried, for a stretch of several months, deliberately staying awake until well past 3, reasoning that if I was already conscious when the hour arrived, there'd be nothing for it to interrupt, no sleep for it to pull me out of. This worked, in its narrow, technical sense. I never once experienced the sensation while already awake. But it came at a cost I couldn't sustain indefinitely. Weeks of exhaustion that started bleeding into the rest of my life in ways that weren't any better than the original problem, just differently shaped. What I've settled into now, the arrangement I've more or less made peace with, is simpler and less effortful than either of those strategies. Mostly because I no longer have the energy to keep fighting something that, as far as I can tell, isn't actually trying to hurt me. Not anymore. Not since that last night in that building. When I wake at 2:58 now, I don't fight it, don't reach for the light, don't try to talk myself out of the sensation through sheer force of rational argument the way I used to. I just lie still, the way I learned to lie still in that south wing treatment bay, and I let it pass through the room the way weather passes, and after a while, it does, and I go back to sleep, and most mornings I don't even fully remember it happened, the way you sometimes don't remember a dream until something later in the day jars it loose. I've thought a great deal, in the time since, about whether I believe the thing in that building was attached to the building itself, confined to it, something that would have stayed behind those walls regardless of what I did or didn't do that night, or whether it followed me out somehow, in some sense I can't fully define, attached now not to a place but to me specifically, the way it seemed to attach itself, however briefly, to my own name spoken through that intercom. I don't have an answer to that question, and I'm not sure I ever will. I've chosen, for my own sake, to believe the former, to believe that whatever I encountered remains exactly where I left it, patient and contained within those crumbling walls, waiting for whoever takes the next overnight contract, if anyone ever does. If the development company ever moves forward with whatever plans they've been sitting on all these years. I choose to believe that because the alternative is harder to live with on a daily basis, and because, 3 years on, I've found that I need some version of an ending, even an uncertain one, even one I'm not entirely sure I trust, simply in order to keep getting up in the morning and living an otherwise ordinary life. But I won't pretend the 2:58 mornings have stopped, because they haven't. Not once, not in 3 years. And some part of me, the part that still remembers exactly what it felt like to stand in that emergency department and watch something disappear without moving. The part that still remembers my own name, spoken back to me through a speaker that should have had nothing behind it but old wiring and dead air, doesn't fully believe my own chosen ending either. Some part of me still wonders, every single time I wake at that hour, whether the thing that learned my name that night ever really stayed where I left it, or whether it simply learned, somewhere in those final minutes before I ran for the doors, a new and more efficient way of finding me. One that no longer requires 4 walls and a long silent hallway. One that only requires, now, the simple ordinary fact that I am still, after everything, someone it once learned to call by name. That's the whole story, as completely and honestly as I know how to tell it. I don't expect you to believe all of it. I'm not sure, on my hardest nights, that I fully believe all of it myself. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw, and I know that I have never, in 3 years, been able to walk past an open doorway after dark, without first checking, however briefly, however much I tell myself it's foolish, that nothing is standing just inside it, waiting, with that particular, patient stillness, for me to finally come close enough to answer back.